In the spring of 1966, a young man named Jim Morrison walked into the offices of a Los Angeles radio promotion company carrying a reel-to-reel tape and a piece of paper with a phone number written on it. He was 22 years old. He had been playing in a band called The Doors for less than a year. He had no manager, no label deal, no industry connections beyond the handful of people who had come to see the band play at the Whiskey A Go-Go, where the residency was new enough that the audiences were still small. What he had was the tape, and the conviction, not the bravado of someone performing confidence they don't feel, but the quieter, more durable conviction of someone who has made something and knows, with the specific knowledge that comes from making things, that what they have made is real. The canvas bag he carried was unremarkable. He was unremarkable in the way that 22-year-olds are unremarkable in Los Angeles when they have not yet become anything that the city has decided to take seriously. What was not unremarkable, though visible to no one in the office that afternoon, was the quality of certainty that he carried alongside the tape. It was the certainty of someone who has listened carefully to what they have made and understood, without requiring external confirmation, that it is real. The tape contained a recording of a song called Light My Fire. It was a demo, rough, not yet fully produced, the band's sound still finding its edges. But the song itself was already what it would become. 7 minutes of music that moved between a controlled opening and an extended central section that seemed, when you gave it your full attention, to open into something larger than the sum of its parts. Jim had written the verse lyrics. Robbie Krieger had written the chorus. Ray Manzarek's keyboard parts gave it an architecture that was at once accessible and strange. John Densmore's drumming held the structure without constraining it. The song was, in the specific way that certain songs are, inevitable, the kind of piece that sounds, on first hearing, like it has always existed, and you are simply now remembering it. The person Jim was trying to reach with the tape was a radio programming consultant named Bill Gavin. Gavin was not the most famous name in the industry, but he was among the most influential in the specific domain that mattered for a new band trying to break through in Los Angeles in 1966, the domain of radio programming decisions. He published a weekly industry newsletter, the Gavin Report, that radio programmers across the country used to understand which records were worth adding to their playlists. His opinion on a song was not the same thing as a guarantee of airplay, but it was as close to a guarantee as the industry had in those years. Getting Bill Gavin to hear your demo and respond favorably was one of the surest paths from the margins of the Los Angeles music scene to the center of it. The Whiskey A Go-Go residency that the Doors had been given in early 1966 was itself a form of evidence, not of commercial success, which was still entirely in the future, but of the specific quality of attention the band was generating in the people who encountered them live. The Whiskey was not a venue that gave residencies to bands without reason. Jim Morrison on stage in 1966 was already the thing he would become, in miniature, the presence, the voice, the specific relationship to the audience that seemed to abolish the usual distance between performer and listener without replacing it with anything false. Jim did not get a favorable response. He did not, in fact, get any response for several weeks. He called the number on the paper twice and left messages that were not returned. He sent the tape through a friend who knew someone at the company. He waited. And then finally a letter arrived, brief, professional, apologetic in the vague way of someone who has made a decision they believe is correct and is discharging the obligation to communicate it with as little friction as possible. The letter said, in summary, that the song was not suitable for radio programming at the present time, that the length was prohibitive, that the structure, which departed from the standard verse-chorus-verse architecture that radio stations preferred, would make it difficult to program effectively, that the band showed promise but would need to develop material more oriented toward conventional commercial formats before a programming recommendation could be made. Jim Morrison read this letter once. He folded it. He put it in the notebook he was carrying at the time, the notebook that is now part of the archival collection and that researchers have examined in detail. And then he went back to work. Researchers who have examined the notebook describe the letter as having been folded carefully rather than crumpled, the fold precise, the creases deliberate, as though Jim had handled it with a kind of respect that was not the same thing as agreement. Around the letter in the notebook's pages are handwritten fragments that date from the same period, lines of poetry, observational notes, the compressed imagery that was his habitual private mode. None of the fragments are about the rejection. None of them are about radio programming or commercial viability or the criteria by which songs were evaluated for addition to playlists. They are about other things entirely, the things Jim Morrison was always writing about, which had nothing to do with the industry's opinion of what he was doing. The response that Jim Morrison had to Bill Gavin's rejection is documented, partially and imperfectly, in the accounts of people who were around him in that period. Ray Manzarek, who would later discuss it in interviews, Pamela Corson, who heard Jim's private account of it, the handful of musicians and venue managers and industry peripherals who occupied the same Los Angeles world. The response across all these accounts has the same basic shape. There was no performance of injury. There was no protracted period of self-doubt. There was no revision of the song in the direction Gavin had suggested. Jim Morrison read the rejection, put it in his notebook, and continued exactly as before, as though the letter had confirmed rather than challenged the direction he was already moving in. I'm not writing for radio, I'm writing for people, and those are two completely different audiences, and one of them matters. Manzarek said in a 1995 interview that he had asked Jim directly what he thought about the rejection, and that Jim had said those words Manzarek had always remembered. Manzarek said he hadn't been certain at the time whether this was genuine equanimity or performed equanimity, whether Jim actually was unbothered by the rejection, or whether the unbotheredness was itself a posture. What he said was that it didn't matter because the behavior in either case was the same. Jim Morrison continued working, continued writing, continued performing at the Whiskey with the same intensity he had brought to the residency before the rejection, and if the rejection had altered anything in his creative practice, the alteration was invisible. The album that became The Doors' debut was recorded later that year in 1966 and released in January 1967. Light My Fire was on the album. In its album version, it ran to 7 minutes, the length that Bill Gavin had identified as prohibitive for radio. It was then edited to a single version of approximately 3 minutes to make it suitable for AM radio programming, a compromise that everyone involved understood as a compromise, a truncation of the song to fit the container rather than an expansion of the container to fit the song. The single was released in April 1967. By the end of July 1967, Light My Fire was the #1 song in the United States. It held that position for 3 weeks. It is one of the best-selling singles of the 1960s and one of the most recognizable pieces of popular music produced by any American artist in the 20th century. The edited single was a truncation that Jim accepted without enthusiasm and without public complaint. He understood that radio had a format and that working within it was a reasonable compromise. What he did not do was allow the editing of the single to be understood as a revision of the song. The song was 7 minutes. The single was an accommodation. The distinction mattered to him. He did not make speeches about it, but it was entirely consistent with the conviction he had expressed when he walked the demo into the office in 1966. He was writing for people. The radio edit was a distribution mechanism. The song itself was unchanged. Bill Gavin was alive to see this happen. He was alive to hear Light My Fire played on every radio station in the country, to watch the song become the foundational hit of a band that would define the cultural moment as completely as any band of that era. He was alive to understand that the letter he had sent in the spring of 1966 had been wrong in every specific particular. The song was not unsuitable for radio. It was a radio phenomenon. The length was not prohibitive. It was extended for the album and truncated for a single that dominated the charts. The structure was not too unconventional. It was exactly unconventional enough to be unlike everything else on the radio at that moment, which was part of why it reached #1. Gavin never wrote publicly about his rejection of Light My Fire. He continued his career. He continued publishing his newsletter. And he carried the knowledge of that spring 1966 letter the way professionals carry the knowledge of significant mistakes, quietly, privately, with the specific weight of something that cannot be undone and therefore must simply be lived with. The industry knowledge of Gavin's rejection circulated in the specific way that such things circulate, through conversations at label offices, through the informal networks of promotion staff and the various intermediaries who processed music from creation to audience. People who had received their own rejection letters from the Gavin report, and there were many, heard about the Light My Fire rejection and processed it differently, depending on what they needed it to mean. The story of what Jim Morrison did with the rejection, the notebook, the equanimity, the continuation became, among the people who knew it, a piece of the larger story about who Jim Morrison was as an artist. It was cited as evidence of the specific quality of his creative conviction, the willingness to hold a position in the face of authorities' disagreement, not through defiance but through the simpler and more durable mechanism of simply not assigning authority the power to determine what was good. Bill Gavin was an expert in radio programming. He was not an expert in music, in the sense that expertise in music means the ability to recognize what is genuinely vital and alive in a piece of work as distinct from what fits the current conventions of the commercial format. Jim Morrison's rejection of his rejection was not arrogance but clarity, the clarity of someone who understood the difference between those two forms of expertise and had correctly identified which one mattered for what he was trying to do. Ray Manzarek told a more complicated version of the story. He said that Jim had been more affected by the rejection than his equanimity suggested, that there had been a period, in the weeks after the letter, when Jim had been quieter than usual, writing more in the notebooks and talking less, the specific withdrawal of someone who is processing something they are not ready to discuss. He said that he had interpreted this not as self-doubt but as intensification, as Jim taking the rejection and using it the way certain people use resistance, as fuel rather than as instruction. He said that some of the material Jim wrote in those weeks, the poetry that ended up in the notebooks and was eventually published in The Lords and the New Creatures, was among the densest and most formally complex work he had produced, as though the rejection had pushed him toward a private creative practice that was entirely beyond the concern of any industry opinion. The more complicated version of the story, Manzarek's version, is the version that contains the most useful information about how Jim Morrison actually worked as an artist. Jim Morrison was not indifferent to rejection. He was not made of different material than the rest of humanity, impervious to the specific sting of being told by an authority that what you have made is not good enough. He felt it, he processed it, and the processing took the form it always took for him. It went into the notebooks, into the private writing practice, into the intensified engagement with language and image that was his most reliable response to difficulty of any kind. This is the Jim Morrison that the mythology finds to accommodate, not the leather-jacketed rebel performing transgression for an audience, not the beautiful self-destructive poet whose excess was itself a form of art, but the person who received a rejection from a radio programming consultant in the spring of 1966 and responded by going home and writing harder. The person who understood at 22 that the difference between writing for radio and writing for people was real and consequential, and that choosing the second over the first was not a sacrifice but a direction. There is a specific quality to the clarity that early rejection produces in certain artists. The clarity of rejection requires the artist to do something difficult, to evaluate the rejection against their own understanding of what they are doing and decide, consciously and with full awareness of the risk they are taking, whether the authority or their own understanding is correct. Most people default to the authority. The authority is visible, it has the weight of institutional credibility. The artist's own understanding is interior, uncertain, available only to the person doing the work. Defaulting to the authority is rational. It is also, in the cases where the authority is wrong, the thing that prevents the work from existing. The Jim Morrison version of the answer is one of the clearer available examples of what happens when an artist receives a rejection from an authority that is genuinely wrong, not wrong in the sense that all critical assessments are subjective, but wrong in the demonstrable, empirical sense that the specific prediction the rejection made about the song's commercial viability turned out to be false. Bill Gavin said Light My Fire was not suitable for radio. Light My Fire reached #1 on the radio. These two facts are in direct and irreconcilable contradiction. Jim Morrison did not default to the authority. He read the letter, put it in his notebook, and kept going. And Light My Fire became #1, and has never stopped being exactly what Jim Morrison knew it was when he carried the demo tape into the offices in the spring of 1966. A real song, written for people who needed something real, fully capable of finding them regardless of what the intermediaries said about its commercial viability. The gap between Gavin's conclusion and the song's subsequent history is the measure of what Jim Morrison understood that Bill Gavin did not, and of what Jim Morrison did with that understanding in the 14 months between the rejection letter and the chart run of July 1967. Bill Gavin died in 1991. He left behind a spring 1966 letter that he never discussed publicly, filed somewhere in the history of a song that became one of the defining pieces of popular music in the 20th century, a letter whose main practical effect was to give Jim Morrison the opportunity to demonstrate, quietly and without drama, the specific and durable quality of conviction that made everything that followed possible. Light My Fire reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 on July 29, 1967. Jim Morrison was 23 years old. He had been carrying the rejection for 14 months, and the song that the Gavin report had deemed unsuitable for radio programming was, at that moment, the song that every radio station in America was playing.